The strangest part wasn't that my husband took another woman to our beach house. It was that he still thought he had the right to open the door. Victoria Hayes stared at the notification glowing on her phone screen, her fingers completely still. One message, one name, one detail that made her entire marriage feel like a lie. New guest access approved, Lauren Mitchell. For a moment, Victoria didn't breathe. She just looked at those words sitting there, cold and emotionless, as if they were nothing more than a routine update. But she knew exactly what they meant. Christopher Whitaker had taken the woman he promised was just a friend to the one place that had always belonged to their family. The beach house in Malibu. The place where they spent their first anniversary. The place where they celebrated every business milestone before Christopher became too busy to come home. The place where Victoria once believed they were building a future together. She slowly placed her coffee cup on the kitchen counter and whispered, "You really did it." Not loudly, not angrily, almost like she was saying goodbye to the version of Christopher she thought she knew. 300 miles away, Christopher was standing in that same beach house, smiling like a man who had finally won. "I still can't believe this place is ours," Lauren Mitchell said, looking through the floor-to-ceiling windows at the ocean. Christopher handed her a glass of sparkling water and smiled. "It's going to be different now. No more old memories. No more complications." He said it casually, like Victoria was a chapter he had already deleted. Lauren looked around the room, admiring the expensive furniture, the artwork, the view. She must have loved this place. Christopher barely paused. She did. But people outgrow things. He didn't know Victoria was hearing the truth in a way he never expected. He didn't know the security system connected to that house still sent alerts to her phone. He didn't know the property agreement he signed years ago was not as simple as he believed. And most importantly, he didn't know the woman he thought he had left behind was no longer waiting for him to realize her worth. Because Victoria Hayes had spent years protecting Christopher's dreams while quietly putting her own life aside. When Christopher was building Aurelius Capital Group from a small investment firm into a respected financial company, Victoria was the person who stayed up late reviewing documents, organized their home, supported him through failures, and celebrated every victory as if it belonged to both of them. But success changed him. Slowly at first. A missed dinner became a regular habit. A late meeting became an excuse. A phone turned face down on the table became something Victoria stopped asking about. She had noticed the distance growing between them long before she knew the reason. But nothing prepared her for seeing her husband give another woman access to the place where their memories lived. Victoria picked up her phone again. She opened the property management app. Her name was still listed. Her rights were still active. She could have called Christopher immediately. She could have demanded answers. She could have asked why he brought Lauren there. But she didn't. Instead, she sat quietly and remembered every time she had been told she was not important enough to be heard. Then she made one phone call. A simple call. The kind of call Christopher never imagined she would make. And while he was standing inside the beach house believing he had finally moved on, the locks were about to remind him of one thing he forgot. Victoria Hayes was never powerless. Victoria did not make that call because she wanted revenge. She made it because, for the first time in years, she was choosing herself. She sat alone in her apartment overlooking downtown Chicago, the city lights reflecting against the quiet window. Her phone was still in her hand, but the screen had already gone dark. The call was over. The request had been made. The process had started. And yet, the hardest part was not what she had done. It was accepting how long she had ignored the signs. For years, Victoria Hayes had been the person behind Christopher Whitaker's success story. When Christopher started Aurelius Capital Group, most people only saw the confident businessman in the tailored suits and expensive offices. They did not see the nights when he came home exhausted, convinced he was failing. They did not see Victoria sitting beside him at the kitchen table, helping him organize ideas, reading through presentations, and reminding him that one difficult year did not define his future. "You are going to make it," she used to tell him. "You just have to remember why you started." Christopher always smiled and said, "I could not do this without you." For a while, Victoria believed those words meant something permanent. But success has a way of changing people. Christopher did not become a different person overnight. That would have been easier to understand. Instead, he changed slowly. A dinner canceled here. A weekend away for work there. Conversations that became shorter. Questions that became annoying to him. Eventually, Victoria felt like she was standing beside someone who was physically present but emotionally somewhere else. The moment she truly understood something was wrong came 6 months earlier. She had been waiting for Christopher to come home so they could celebrate their 15th wedding anniversary. She had prepared his favorite dinner and placed an old photograph of them near the table. It was from before the company became successful, before the luxury cars, before the private meetings, before everything became about appearances. Christopher arrived 2 hours late. He looked at the table, looked at the photo, and simply said, "Victoria, I do not have time for this tonight." Those words stayed with her. Not because he missed dinner, not because he was late, but because he looked at their memories like they were an inconvenience. A few weeks later, she found the first signs that something was happening. Hotel receipts she never knew about. Unexplained meetings. A name that appeared too often. Lauren Mitchell. At first, Victoria wanted to believe there was another explanation. She wanted to believe the man she built a life with would never disrespect their marriage. But the truth had a way of showing itself. And now Christopher had taken Lauren to their beach house, the one place he knew carried years of memories. He did not just make a mistake. He crossed a line. The next morning, Christopher woke up expecting everything to continue normally. He checked his phone, adjusted his schedule, and prepared for a business call. He had no idea that while he was planning his day, Victoria was reviewing documents that would change the balance between them forever. Her attorney, Marcus Reed, had already looked through the ownership agreement. "Victoria, I want you to be certain before we move forward," Marcus said. "Once this begins, Christopher will know you are not the person he thought you were." Victoria looked down at the papers in front of her. For years, Christopher believed he was the one holding all the power. He believed Victoria's kindness meant weakness. Her patience meant dependence. Her silence meant she had nothing to say. But he misunderstood the woman he married. "I am certain," Victoria said quietly. "I am not trying to hurt him. I just want what is mine." And somewhere on the coast, Christopher was about to discover that the woman he underestimated had been preparing for a future he never saw coming. Christopher Whitaker had spent years believing every problem had a solution if he had enough money, enough influence, or the right people around him. That belief was exactly why he never noticed the one person he should have paid attention to. The woman who knew him before the expensive suits, before the headlines, before everyone started calling him a success. Victoria Hayes knew the difference between the man Christopher used to be and the man he had become. And now she was about to let him face that difference on his own. The morning after Victoria spoke with Marcus Reed, Christopher arrived at the Malibu beach house with a completely different attitude. The confusion from the night before had disappeared. He assumed the access issue was just a technical mistake. "I will call the property manager," he told Lauren casually. "These systems have problems all the time." Lauren looked relieved. "So everything is fine?" Christopher smiled. "Of course it is." That confidence was something Victoria had seen many times before. Christopher was at his best when he believed he could control the situation. He walked through the house like nothing had changed. He poured coffee in the kitchen where Victoria once baked birthday cakes. He stood near the windows where they used to watch sunsets together. But now, every corner carried a different meaning. The house was no longer a symbol of their marriage. It had become proof of how careless he had become. Meanwhile, Victoria was sitting across from Marcus in his downtown office, looking through the documents that connected her to the property. The agreement was not complicated. Years earlier, when Christopher was expanding Aurelius Capital Group, Victoria had contributed part of her own investment portfolio to help stabilize the company during a difficult period. In return, certain family assets, including the beach house, were protected under a separate agreement. Christopher knew about the documents. He simply never thought they would matter. "He probably believes you are trying to punish him," Marcus said. Victoria looked at the papers quietly. "That is the problem. He always thinks everything is about him." Marcus leaned back. "Then what is this about?" Victoria took a moment before answering. "It is about respect. I spent years protecting his image. I covered for him when he missed important moments. I defended him when people questioned his decisions. But somewhere along the way, he stopped seeing me as his partner." She closed the folder. "I am done proving my value to someone who decided not to see it." Across town, Christopher finally received a message from the property management company. He expected an apology. Instead, he received a request for a verification meeting regarding his current access privileges. His expression changed. "What is this?" he asked. Lauren noticed immediately. Is something wrong? Christopher quickly locked his phone. No, it is just paperwork. But for the first time, a small doubt entered his mind. He called the property manager directly. Why am I being asked to verify access to my own house? The response was polite but firm. Mr. Whitaker, the property records have been updated according to the ownership agreement. Christopher went silent. Updated by who? The answer came after a short pause. By Mrs. Victoria Hayes. That name sounded different now. Not like the woman he thought he had left behind. Not like the wife who waited for him to come home. It sounded like someone he no longer understood. Christopher ended the call and stared out at the ocean. Lauren asked, what did she do? He did not answer immediately, because deep down, he knew something had shifted. Victoria was not begging. She was not fighting for his attention. She was simply using a power he never believed she had. And that was the first moment Christopher realized the woman he underestimated might be the one person he could no longer control. Christopher Whitaker had faced difficult negotiations, angry investors, and business setbacks before. He knew how to walk into a room, control the conversation, and make people believe he had everything under control. But standing inside the beach house that afternoon, with the ocean behind him and a locked door in front of him, Christopher felt something he had not felt in years. Uncertainty. He tried the key card again. Nothing happened. He frowned and tapped it against the sensor. The small red light blinked back at him. That does not make any sense, he said quietly. Lauren watched from behind him, her confidence starting to fade. Christopher, maybe you should call someone. He pulled out his phone immediately. I am handling it. That was the phrase he always used. I am handling it. It was the same phrase he used when Victoria asked if something was wrong in their marriage. The same phrase he used when she asked why he was coming home later every week. The same phrase he used when he believed problems disappeared simply because he refused to admit they existed. A few minutes later, the property manager answered his call. Mr. Whitaker, how can I help you? Christopher kept his voice calm. My access to the beach house has been removed. I assume this is an error. There was a short silence on the other end. It is not an error, Mr. Whitaker. Christopher looked toward the locked door. Then explain it. The manager spoke carefully. The access changes were authorized according to the property agreement. Christopher's jaw tightened. By who? Another pause. By Victoria Hayes. For a moment, Christopher said nothing. He ended the call and stood there, staring at the house he once believed belonged to him. Lauren stepped closer. She did this. Christopher looked away. She changed the access. Lauren crossed her arms. But why would she still have that kind of control? That question bothered him more than he wanted to admit. Because the truth was, he had stopped paying attention to Victoria's role in their life years ago. He remembered her as the woman who managed the details. The woman who supported him. The woman who always adjusted when his world changed. He never considered that she had been quietly protecting assets, building connections, and maintaining the foundation beneath everything he enjoyed. While Christopher was trying to understand what happened, Victoria was sitting in her attorney's office reviewing the final documents. Marcus Reed placed a folder in front of her. Once this becomes official, Christopher will know you are serious. Victoria looked at the papers. He already knows. Marcus studied her expression. How do you feel? It was a simple question, but Victoria had spent months avoiding the answer. She thought about the woman she had been, the wife who waited, the partner who always gave another chance, the person who kept trying to fix something that only one person was fighting for. I feel like I finally stopped carrying something that was never mine alone to carry, she said. Marcus nodded. That is usually when people become the strongest. Later that evening, Christopher returned to his office and searched through old company records. For the first time, he was not looking for a way to win. He was looking for what he had missed. He found agreements he barely remembered signing, documents Victoria had prepared, investments she had protected, decisions she had influenced without ever demanding recognition. His assistant entered the room. Mr. Whitaker, there is something else. Christopher looked up. What? Several partners are asking questions about the beach house situation. They want to know if there are other agreements involving your personal assets. Christopher felt the pressure building. The problem was no longer just a house. It was the image he had carefully built. The image of a man who controlled everything. He looked at his phone and saw Victoria's name. For the first time in a long time, he hesitated before calling her. Because deep down, Christopher understood something he had refused to accept. Victoria was not trying to take his life away. She was taking back the parts of hers that he had convinced himself belonged to him. And tomorrow, when he finally reached out, he would not be calling the woman he left behind. He would be calling the woman who had already moved ahead without him. Christopher Whitaker spent the entire night trying to convince himself that the situation was temporary. A misunderstanding. A technical issue. Something that could be fixed with one phone call and the right explanation. But the more he looked through the documents on his desk, the harder it became to ignore the truth. Victoria had not acted suddenly. She had been prepared. The next morning, Christopher arrived at Victoria's attorney's office without an appointment. It was the kind of thing he used to do when he believed people would always make time for him. Marcus Reed looked surprised when Christopher walked through the door. "Mr. Whitaker, I was not expecting you." Christopher placed his phone on the desk and kept his voice controlled. "I need to understand what Victoria is trying to do." Marcus did not move. "What makes you think she is trying to do something?" Christopher paused. The question bothered him because he already knew the answer. The beach house access was changed. Marcus nodded. "Because the agreement allowed it." Christopher leaned forward. "She is my wife." Marcus looked at him calmly. "No, Mr. Whitaker. That is exactly what changed." The words landed harder than Christopher expected. For years, he had thought of divorce as a business decision. A document. A signature. A clean ending. But sitting there, he realized something uncomfortable. He had treated Victoria like a contract he could cancel when it stopped benefiting him. Marcus opened the folder in front of him. "You need to understand something. Victoria did not wake up yesterday and decide to fight you. She spent years making sure your company, your investments, and your personal assets were protected." Christopher looked at the papers. "She never told me any of this." Marcus gave a small nod. "That was her mistake. She believed partnership meant trust." Those words stayed with Christopher. Because somewhere along the way, he had confused Victoria's silence with permission. He had mistaken her patience for weakness. Across town, Victoria was meeting with the property management team to finalize the changes. She walked through every detail carefully. She was not trying to embarrass Christopher. She was not trying to create a scene. She simply wanted boundaries that should have existed all along. After the meeting, her phone rang. "Christopher." She stared at the screen for a moment before answering. "Hello." His voice sounded different. Less confident. More careful. "Victoria, we need to talk." She looked out the window at the busy street below. "About what?" There was a pause. "About the beach house. About everything." Victoria took a slow breath. "Christopher, the beach house is not the problem." He became quiet. "Then what is?" Her answer was simple. "The problem is that you thought you could erase me from a life we built together and still keep everything that came with it." Christopher did not respond immediately. For once, he had no prepared answer. No business strategy. No perfect explanation. "I made mistakes," he finally said. Victoria closed her eyes briefly. "You did more than make mistakes. You made choices." That sentence stayed between them. Because she was right. A mistake happens once. A choice happens every time someone decides not to change. Christopher wanted to defend himself. He wanted to explain the pressure, the company, the expectations, all the reasons he used to justify his actions. But none of those reasons changed what happened. Before ending the call, Victoria said something he did not expect. "I do not want your company. I do not want your reputation. I want the respect I should have had from the beginning." Christopher sat silently after the call ended. And for the first time, he realized the woman he thought he had abandoned was not waiting for him to understand her. She had already understood herself. But as Christopher began looking deeper into his own business records, he discovered the beach house was only the beginning. There was another issue waiting inside Aurelius Capital Group, one that could change everything he had built. Christopher Whitaker thought the biggest problem was losing access to the beach house. He thought the worst moment was standing outside a locked door while realizing Victoria still had control over something he believed belonged to him. But he was about to learn that the beach house was only the first crack in the image he had spent years protecting. The real problem was inside Aurelius Capital Group, the company he built, the company he believed proved he was untouchable. That morning, Christopher walked into his office expecting to regain control. Instead, he found his executive team waiting for him. The atmosphere was different. Nobody looked angry. Nobody accused him of anything. That almost made it worse. "What is going on?" Christopher asked as he placed his briefcase down. His chief financial officer, Daniel Carter, looked at him carefully. There are questions from several partners about the personal asset disclosures connected to the company. Christopher frowned. Personal assets? Daniel nodded. Specifically, agreements created during the early years of Aurelius Capital Group. Christopher already knew what agreements he meant. The ones Victoria helped create. The ones he barely looked at because he trusted her to handle details. This is about Victoria, he said. Daniel did not answer immediately. That silence told Christopher everything. Later that afternoon, Christopher reviewed old files he had not opened in years. Page after page showed Victoria's involvement. She was not just the person who supported him at home. She had been part of the foundation that allowed him to build the company. She had helped structure investments. She had protected key assets. She had negotiated with advisors when Christopher was too focused on expansion. And she never asked for public credit. Christopher leaned back in his chair, staring at the documents. For the first time, he saw the years of marriage differently. He remembered every time Victoria said, "We will figure it out." He remembered every time she stood beside him when others doubted him. But he also remembered the moments when he stopped seeing her as a partner and started seeing her as someone who would always be there. That evening, Christopher met Lauren at a restaurant in downtown Los Angeles. He expected comfort. Instead, he noticed something different. Lauren was not asking if he was okay. She was asking what would happen next. "Are you sure this will not affect your company?" she asked. Christopher looked at her. "That is what you are worried about." Lauren quickly smiled. "I am just thinking about the future." The future. The word stayed with him. Because suddenly Christopher wondered if Lauren had ever been interested in the man behind the success, or only the life that success provided. Meanwhile, Victoria sat at home reviewing her own plans. She was not celebrating Christopher's problems. She was not enjoying watching his world become uncertain. She was simply moving forward. Her phone rang. It was Marcus Reed. "Victoria, there is something you need to know." His voice was serious. "We found another document." Victoria looked up. "What kind of document?" Marcus opened the file in front of him. "A transfer agreement connected to the beach house. Christopher signed it 3 years ago." Victoria frowned. "Why does that matter?" Marcus paused before answering. "Because he did not just give Lauren access to the property. He tried to change the ownership structure without informing you." Victoria went quiet. This was different. The beach house was no longer just about betrayal. It was about a decision Christopher made behind her back that could have affected everything they built together. Marcus continued, "There is one more thing. The document has a problem." Victoria looked at the papers in front of her. "What problem?" Marcus lowered his voice. "Christopher's signature is there, but the approval process was never completed." Victoria slowly realized what that meant. Christopher believed he had taken something from her, but in reality, he had only exposed how far he was willing to go without telling the truth. And now, the question was no longer whether Victoria would take back control. The question was how much more Christopher had been hiding. Christopher Whitaker always believed problems became smaller when they were handled quickly. A difficult conversation, a complicated contract, a business disagreement. He built his entire career on making decisions before anyone else could react. But this time, the problem was not something he could solve with confidence and a phone call. Because the person standing across from him was someone who knew every part of the story he tried to hide. The next morning, Christopher sat across from Marcus Reed again, this time with a different expression. The confidence was still there, but it was mixed with frustration. "You are telling me the transfer agreement means nothing?" Christopher asked. Marcus calmly looked through the documents. "I am telling you that you believed it gave you more power than it actually did." Christopher leaned back. "Victoria knew about this?" "She knew enough," Marcus replied. "The difference is, she never used that knowledge against you until now." Those words bothered Christopher, because he realized Victoria had spent years knowing more than he thought. She had not been unaware. She had not been blind. She had simply chosen not to fight every battle. And now he was starting to understand that her patience had never been the same as weakness. Meanwhile, Victoria was preparing for a meeting with the board members connected to Aurelius Capital Group. She did not want to damage Christopher's company. That was never her goal. But she also refused to protect someone who had stopped protecting her. When she entered the conference room, several executives looked surprised. Many of them remembered Victoria from the early days of the company. They remembered the woman who helped Christopher build relationships, organize plans, and keep everything together when there was more ambition than resources. One executive smiled slightly. "It has been a long time, Victoria." She nodded. It has. The meeting began with a simple question. Who had authority over the disputed assets connected to the company? The answer was clear. The agreements were valid. The documents were legal. And the person Christopher underestimated had been one of the people who helped create the structure protecting those assets. Back at his office, Christopher received the update. His assistant placed the report on his desk. The board wants clarification before the next investor meeting. Christopher opened the file. His face changed as he read the details. This was no longer about a beach house. It was about trust. Investors did not like uncertainty. Partners did not like surprises. And Christopher had spent years building a reputation as someone who always knew what was happening. Now people were asking the one question he hated most. What else did he not know? That evening, Christopher finally confronted Lauren about the situation. They met at a quiet restaurant, away from the places where people recognized him. I need honesty, he said. Lauren looked confused. About what? Christopher studied her carefully. When everything changed, when you thought I had lost control, were you still here because of me? Lauren looked away for a moment. Christopher, that is not fair. He heard the answer before she finished speaking. Not because she admitted anything, but because she avoided the one thing that mattered. The next day, Christopher received another message from Marcus. We found something else. Christopher opened the attachment. His eyes moved across the page, and for the first time, he looked genuinely concerned. It was another agreement. Another decision made without Victoria's knowledge. But this time, it was connected directly to the future of Aurelius Capital Group. Christopher realized the truth too late. The woman he thought was trying to take everything from him was actually the person who had been protecting everything all along. And now, he was about to discover what happened when that protection was finally removed. Christopher Whitaker spent years believing control was something he could always regain. If a deal went wrong, he negotiated. If a person challenged him, he convinced them. If a problem appeared, he moved faster than everyone else. But now, for the first time in his life, Christopher was facing a situation where speed and confidence could not protect him. Because the person who knew the truth was the same person he had spent years underestimating. Victoria Hayes. The next morning, the atmosphere inside Aurelius Capital Group was unlike anything Christopher had experienced before. The executive floor that once felt like his territory suddenly felt unfamiliar. People were polite, but careful. Conversations stopped when he walked by. Everyone wanted answers. Christopher entered the boardroom and saw the documents already waiting on the table. He looked at Daniel Carter, the chief financial officer. Tell me exactly what is happening. Daniel opened the folder. The investor review found inconsistencies in several personal asset disclosures. The issue is not the beach house itself. The issue is the pattern. Christopher looked confused. What pattern? Daniel took a breath. The pattern of decisions made without full transparency. The words were professional, but Christopher understood what they meant. His own reputation was built on trust. And now people were questioning the one thing he had always protected. His image. Meanwhile, Victoria met with Marcus Reed one more time. She expected another legal discussion. Another document. Another complicated issue connected to Christopher's decisions. But Marcus had something else. He placed a small envelope on the table. This was found during the review. Victoria opened it carefully. Inside was a copy of an old agreement from the early years of Aurelius Capital Group. She read the first page, then stopped. Christopher signed this. Marcus nodded. Yes. Victoria looked confused. Why would he keep this hidden? Marcus pointed to one section of the document. Because this agreement shows something important. Your contribution was not just financial. You were listed as a strategic partner during the company's foundation period. Victoria stared at the page. For years, Christopher had told people she supported him. But behind closed doors, he had slowly rewritten the story until it sounded like he built everything alone. Marcus continued. There is more. This agreement gives you certain rights if company assets are affected by personal decisions. Victoria leaned back quietly. She had never wanted control over Christopher's success. She only wanted the respect that disappeared along the way. But now she understood something. The truth was bigger than their marriage. It was about the story Christopher had created about himself. Later that evening, Christopher arrived at the beach house alone. For the first time, he was not there to show someone what he owned. He was there because he needed to remember what he had lost. He walked through the room slowly. The kitchen where Victoria used to prepare meals after his long workdays. the living room where they celebrated the first major investment that changed their lives. The small corner near the window where Victoria used to sit with her laptop, helping him prepare presentations. He finally understood something that had been invisible to him. The life he called his achievement had always been built by two people. His phone rang. It was Lauren. Christopher answered. Hello. Her voice sounded distant. I think we need to talk. Christopher already knew what that meant. The person who stayed when everything looked perfect was no longer certain she wanted to stay when things became difficult. After the call ended, another message appeared. It was from Marcus. One sentence. Christopher has requested a private meeting with Victoria. Victoria read the message and placed her phone down. She knew this moment would come, but she also knew something else. Christopher was not coming to explain. He was coming because he finally understood the cost of losing someone who had always believed in him. And this time, Victoria would not be the woman waiting for him to change. She would be the woman deciding whether he deserved a second conversation at all. Christopher Whitaker arrived at the small coffee shop near the waterfront 15 minutes early. It was a place Victoria used to love because it was quiet, simple, and far away from the world of business meetings and carefully prepared appearances. Years ago, Christopher would have considered a place like this too ordinary for an important conversation. But now, sitting alone by the window, he realized he was finally in a place where he could not hide behind success. When Victoria walked in, she did not look angry. She did not look like someone who came to celebrate his problems. She simply looked like someone who had finally found peace. Christopher stood up. Thank you for meeting with me. Victoria nodded and sat down. I am listening. Those 3 words were different from anything he had heard from her before. Not because they were cold, because they were calm. Christopher took a breath. I know I hurt you. Victoria looked at him quietly. You did. He lowered his eyes. I spent so much time trying to become someone important that I forgot the person who was there before anyone knew my name. For the first time, Christopher was not defending himself. He was not explaining his choices. He was simply admitting them. Victoria looked outside at the passing cars. Do you know what hurt the most? She asked. Christopher waited. It was not the beach house. It was not even Lauren. She looked back at him. It was realizing that you stopped seeing me as your partner. You started seeing me as someone who would always adjust, always forgive, always stay. Christopher had no answer because he knew she was right. He had confused love with certainty. He believed because Victoria loved him, she would never leave. But he never considered what would happen when the person who always stayed finally chose herself. Over the following months, Aurelius Capital Group went through major changes. Christopher remained involved, but things were different. He learned that leadership was not about controlling every outcome. It was about accepting responsibility when things went wrong. The investors who once admired his confidence began respecting his honesty. It was not an easy transformation. Real change rarely is. Lauren eventually disappeared from his life. Not because Victoria forced her away. Not because Christopher lost everything. But because when the image of success faded, there was no longer anything for Lauren to chase. Victoria, meanwhile, built something completely different. She launched her own investment foundation focused on supporting women who had put their dreams aside while helping others succeed. She kept the beach house, but it no longer represented the marriage she lost. It represented the life she reclaimed. 1 year later, Victoria stood on the balcony overlooking the ocean. The same view that once reminded her of betrayal now reminded her of freedom. A friend standing beside her smiled and asked, Do you ever think about what would have happened if you stayed? Victoria looked toward the waves and smiled softly. I used to think losing him was the hardest thing I ever experienced. She paused, but then I realized I was not losing him. I was finding myself. Somewhere across the city, Christopher looked at an old photograph from the early days of his company. It showed 2 people who believed they could build something together. He finally understood the lesson he had missed for years. Success was never just about the empire you create. It was about the people who stood beside you before the world knew your name. Because sometimes the person you underestimate is not the person who leaves you behind. Sometimes they are the person who teaches you the greatest lesson of your life. And sometimes the greatest revenge is not watching someone fall. It is building a life so meaningful that you no longer need to look back.